Hi there, welcome to IndyCar on, what is it, the 19th? Double check. Yeah, the 19th of November. Okay, so there's a number of interesting topics in today's program. The first one is to do with forestry, and in an article published in today's Ferry newspaper, the Ferret, I think, to some extent, is a highly underrated resource when it comes to getting stories before they become big news. But today's story from the Ferret regards Scotland's forestry. And it looks at a preliminary report on the ownership of Scotland's forests as it stands at the moment before it's published. And it has found that 75% of the forest area of Scotland, including the Highlands and all the shooting estates and all the rest of it, is owned by just 164 individuals and firms. Most of them appear to be absentee landlords or investment companies looking to make profit from basically sharecropping monoculture fir trees, pine trees that are planted in vast plantations, which do nothing very much at all, if anything, to help the reforestation and the stability of the wildlife in Scotland. However, the interesting thing about this is that the report shows that the vested interests in Scotland's forestry make it far more difficult for local groups and communities to buy land when it does become available, because they're often priced out of the market by basically things like pension fund managers who are looking to buy up the land as an investment, have it planted with millions of cloned trees, to have a share crop at the end of, say, 25 or 40 years, which is going to turn a profit. So when the profit motive is involved in land sales in Scotland, obviously the big movers and shakers come in to outbid one another to get the best plots of land. Some of them are in fact obviously owned by major estates, shooting estates, things like that. And it's very difficult, as I've said, for small groups and local communities to buy even small parcels of land for themselves to benefit from. Now that poses problems for the Scottish Government, which is about to publish its land reform bill paper, which I think is coming up in the next few months. And it was looking at ways in which it could make it easier for such groups to buy land and to invest in the reforestation of the wildlands of Scotland. However, this is a problem that they're going to face from the word go. There is no way that the Scottish Government with its land reform bill can do very much at all other than make it easier to understand who actually owns certain parts of Scotland's lands, especially in the Highlands, and how much of that forestry is basically sharecrop. In other words, they grow it like wheat, cut it all down, clear fell the whole lot, replant again. And as I've said, this creates vast wastelands in Scotland's Highlands rather than the sustainable environment that people are wanting to see in the reforestation of these vast tracts of land. So perhaps the land reform bill is going to come to a screeching halt, because simply it's not possible, while Scotland is part of the Union, to do anything very much about land ownership. Land is basically just sold according to what it's worth to investors, rather than for the benefit of the people who actually live in the local areas, who would benefit from a managed forestry project of the kinds that operate in places like Finland, where there are vast tracts of mixed forest which are not clear felled every 45 years and replanted, leaving just basically broken ground and twigs lying behind them. They actually manage the forests, take out the mature trees and replant new saplings. So the forest is always there, it's always regenerating, but that's not what's happening in Scotland, which is what needs to happen in Scotland. The other piece of information today, I was looking at ferries, but I'll come back to them in a minute. But I mentioned in my most recent programme the omission of Scotland's space industries from BBC's reporting of the space industry in the UK. Now, the space industry in the UK is largely based on a model of something like 7 launch areas dotted around the United Kingdom, many of which are in Scotland. The one which was focused upon most recently was the Saxiford launch complex in the north of Shetland. Now, it's an ideal place to launch polar orbiting satellites, the kind that look at the land beneath as they are circling over the poles. It's perfect for watching the land. It's perfect for spy satellites, which I think is one of the major reasons why Lockheed Martin chose to invest a huge sum of money in the United Kingdom's efforts to build a launch complex somewhere in Scotland. There are other complexes other than Saxavord, but Saxavord is the one which seems to have come on the most. But what's interesting about Saxavord is the fact that most of the money needed to develop the site was not provided by the United Kingdom at all. In fact, the site's owners and the manager of the site, they've had to find their own funding for this. The United Kingdom did not come up with the goods. And according to the CEO of the company which is running the Saxavord site, they've built the basic infrastructure. They have to build an assembly hangar and a few other things, as well as obviously laying in a road complex and power and so on. They've done all of that, but they think by the time they've finished investing in this site, they will have spent £43 million of their own money to do so. It's hardly really a British space project. Not only that, but at the moment, the BBC can only tell us about one or two companies which aren't even British planning to launch there, despite the fact that there are two Scottish launcher firms ready to launch. Both Skyrora and Orbix have got prototypes ready to launch, and yet they don't get a mention. I'm pretty sure that the reason they're not launching is probably because they have to apply to the British Space Programme and the Civil Aviation Authority for a launch licence, and that could be the thing that's holding them up. Anyway, more investigation would be needed to find that out. But I discovered today another documentary on the British Space Programme on YouTube. Not, I don't think, manufactured by the BBC this time. However, it also focused everywhere in the UK except Scotland when it came to actual space industries. They looked at Virgin Orbital as the first British space launch attempt, and this was Sir Richard Branson's retired jumbo jet with a small rocket slung under its wing with a package of, I think, 3 satellites. The idea was that the jet would take off from its Cornish base, which is supposed to be the horizontal launch platform for the British space programme, taken up to high altitude, released from the wing of the plane. The rocket then fires and takes the payloads into orbit, except that unfortunately, although it launched okay, the first stage seemed to have performed all right. The second stage failed to ignite, and all 3 satellites ended up crashing into the Atlantic. And shortly after that, Sir Richard Branson's company, Virgin Orbital, filed for bankruptcy protection, which I think just goes to show you how little confidence there is in the British space launch system based on that particular model. However, that wasn't the end of the documentary. After focusing on that failure, they then went on to talk about a small Welsh satellite manufacturer who was trying to get into the market as well, but couldn't. And all the way through this programme, nothing was mentioned, as far as I could see, about the massive space industry in Scotland that already exists, including what used to be Clyde Space, the satellite manufacturer, the largest volume satellite manufacturer in Europe, in fact the second biggest in the world. Nothing about that, and nothing about Skyrora, and nothing about Orbix. So it seems that this airbrushing of the Scottish space industry out of existence is not just confined to the BBC. Now, I have some further bits and pieces of news gleaned from the media today about the ferries as well. And although we've been distracted by people's iPad bills and things like that on the news, which, to be honest with you, is just so pathetic, it's unbelievable. The only way they can stack the SNP is by looking at their iPad bills when they're watching football matches on holiday. It is pretty pathetic. However, this news about the ferries is interesting. It seems that the Scottish Government is planning not to put the Western Isles ferries out to tender as they normally would, to find a private provider who can provide the ferry services. And we know that the ferries that are being run by CalMac at the moment are prone to breakdowns. They're well past their sell-by date. Most of the ferries are now very much in the last stages of their decline, need to be replaced, and we know the story of the replacement for the Glen Sannox. However, one of the things which interested me was the fact that a catamaran ferry I think it's the MV Alfred, it's called, owned by Pentland Ferries, was chartered to take over from the Glen Sannox, which normally would run from Ardrossan on the mainland of the Clyde coast to Arran. And this catamaran ferry is very much like the type that Jim Ballantyne was talking about manufacturing here in Scotland to take over from this ageing fleet of conventionally built heavy diesel operated ferries that we've been relying on for so long. And it seems as though the MV Alfred has been making a pretty good job of it. Past all its sea trials, it's been operating a regular service, doesn't seem to have faced any technical difficulties, handled the sea state, no problem at all. And of course it's huge, because a catamaran ferry is much wider than a conventional ship. It's much more stable, it carries more cars, and of course it's faster. So it looked to me at least as though the idea of catamaran ferries has been proved in practice by Pentland Ferries lending this ferry, which normally runs the Orkney route, for the benefit of the Calmac passengers in Ardrossan and on Arran. However, the Western Isles of Scotland have been suffering severe outages of their ferries for some time because they're so old and they're not being replaced. So it's interesting that the Scottish Government is bypassing the idea of tenders because they can't guarantee that they will get a ferry in time, and therefore Calmac is going to have to carry the can for the time being. However, there is a good side to this, which is the RMT union's leader, Mick Lynch, has welcomed this move because he believes that a publicly owned infrastructure ferry company such as Calmac is essential, but it really needs to be further developed, and the procurement problems which the Scottish Government have faced in recent years need to be fixed in order for this plan to work. So I think the takeaway from today's programme, bearing in mind these three very varied topics, is that land ownership in Scotland is not something that can be solved while we're in the Union. We would need to actually be able to take possession of these vast tracts of land and be able to acquire them at market price. That means raising a lot of capital to buy them back, because we have no other way of bringing them back into public ownership or making them affordable to local groups and individuals to buy parcels of land. So being independent is probably the only way we can solve this land ownership problem in Scotland. The same, I think, goes for the ferries. We need more investment capital in order to invest in a much larger and more standardised and efficient means of manufacturing ferries. Ballantyne's offer would have been ideal had the government been able to raise enough capital to do it. And of course they can't, because the Scottish Government's not allowed to borrow money. It can borrow a certain amount, but it's difficult for them to do it. And then there's the vanishing Scottish space programme, which does exist, but according to the mainstream media and now this programme on YouTube, Scotland hasn't got any space industry at all. Interestingly, speaking of ferries, there has now been a successful bid to provide a ferry service running from, I think it's Rosyth, all the way to Dunkirk in northern France, and this would be the first of a major ferry and freight operation operating from the east coast of Scotland to the northwest coast of France, connecting us with mainland Europe and enabling a large amount of freight to sail directly from a Scottish port directly to the destination on the continent, bypassing all the English motorways, the Channel Tunnel and all the ferries down in the south of England. Would vastly reduce the costs and increase the capacity that could be exported. So that is good news, but it seems to me that if you want anything done in Scotland and you're a fairly big company, you're trying to export or you're trying to build a new industry, you're pretty much on your own, unless Scotland becomes independent and some investment capital can be found. There's not really much we can do other than what individual companies are trying to do for themselves at the moment. But anybody succeeding in Scotland and doing these things is doing so despite the UK government, not because of it. And we know that something like 500 billion pounds, something like that, was a tremendous amount of money, was wasted by the Tory government over the last term of its government. In fact, I'm wrong, I think it was 100 million, I think, was wasted. There was figures being bandied around, a colossal amount of money wasted by the Tory government, all of which is now debt hanging around the necks of everybody who's still attached to the United Kingdom. So frankly, I think we need to become independent to do something about all of these issues. But it's going to take a competent government to do it as well. Anyway, that's it from me today. I hope that's been food for thought for everybody, as usual. I'll be back again later in the week. Please keep donating when you can. I haven't put the donating link on this particular programme because I was in a bit of a rush. But you know where to find me. That's it from IndyCar today. Keep the faith, and I'll speak to you again later in the week. Bye-bye for now.